Good morning. Please turn with me to Lamentations, the third chapter, as we look at the title, Steadfast. Steadfast. And that's an extra preachery title for me. I usually try to find something that's not quite as preachery, but it's a quote. And it's a quote from a very famous part of the Bible. This passage, it talks about the steadfast love of the Lord, right? But you know me. I can almost hear it when the passage is being read. Even when I pick a happy passage, they're like, I know he's not leaving it there. Just go ahead and get to the unhappy parts so you can mess it up for us. Like singing a song, a great song out of key. Hopefully I won't be doing that though. But the reality is, the book of Lamentations comes at a time when they're lamenting stuff. And it surprised me that this otherwise hopeful passage came in the middle of a book that is entirely devoted to regret in a lot of ways, the way we verbalize our regrets. But the upside is, ultimately, by the time we get to the end of the first section of verses, roughly the first 18 verses, it's going to be completely hopeless. It's literally going to say that it seems that way. But the question is, how do we get a passage like that in the scripture reading out of a situation in which they have almost given up hope? And that's the context of the famous passage that led to the famous song, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end." With that, though, let me start out with the story. The whole concept of steadfast, when I was trying to think of how to illustrate it, I was thinking of one of my, actually over the years, been a great friend, great family. They're from Zimbabwe, and they're doing super well right now. However, one of the realities of them trying to take care of family back home, where they ended up moving to, was the fact that, much like we're dealing with inflation right now, it's nothing compared to what they were dealing with in Zimbabwe a few years back, when you could pay, I don't know, it was in the tens of thousands of dollars, Zimbabwean dollars, for a loaf of bread, because the currency came unhinged from any legitimate source of value. We used to tie our currency to the gold standard that kept it from drifting too much. And at this period of time, no matter who you're looking at, voting for come November, everybody's trying to find a way to attach the currency to something that helps it retain its value. As polar opposites as everybody is, that's the one thing everybody's trying to find a solution to, right? And that's because it has a spiritual application as well. What they are realizing as they are going out of their period of destruction and trying to build on their way moving forward, they're trying to say, I know that if, it's one thing to get mercy, I love mercy, but as we talk about from time to time, what's my second chance going to look like? And that's the value in the book of Lamentations. Once they get all the pain out of the way, once they're talking about how he really did what he said he was going to do, and they're talking about how no matter how much he warned us, we could not have imagined it looking this bad. Eventually, part of the book of the Lamentations is getting the pain out of the way so you can get to planning what your second chance is going to look like. And that's what we're looking at in Lamentations chapter 3. Beginning about verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Please pause there for me as we are going to look at this chapter through the lens of the question of why. Maybe 4 or 5 whys that will help us understand where they are at in their period of hopelessness. Why? Because if you've ever been in despair, one of the things that goes along with my periods of hopelessness is I don't understand why or how to get out of it. So the first why here is, why was it that God was telling them, like we say so often from Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, today if you hear his voice, don't ignore it, because where the warnings are leading you is a place it's hard to imagine. So he's talking about the darkness in verse 2, where he's talking about having no light, which is made worse by verse 3, where he's going to say, surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. A lot of this is going to be review, because we talked about it's bad enough when life seems like it is stacked against me, but the seeming gives me a little bit of hope, because sometimes people can appeal to me and help me understand it's not as bad as it seems. However, when God turns against you, it's as bad as it seems. It's probably worse than advertised. So now they are in dark places where they can't see a way out, and God really is their enemy. That's what they're lamenting right now. The hope really is just disappointing you, because any hope they can give you is based on lies. God is really mad, and he is really doing this. And reality is acknowledging what it takes to cut the period of time short, God willing, that he is willing to stand opposed to me and my future. as they're going to add to that, verse 4. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. Understanding how verses 4 and 5 are talking about how we said, it's one thing for me to exist in a situation, but a lot of times I exist without fully appreciating all the things that go into making my happiness. And so as God is bringing them into a place of repentance, he is hitting one by one the things that they took for granted. He's hitting their body. Oh, and I can deal with some attacks on my body if, once again, I have hope. But verse 5 is saying he's filled them with bitterness. And so now he's combining the attacks on their actual physical health with an outlook that says this does not seem like there is actually a remedy for this thing. And so he is stacking the reasons, the legitimate reasons they have to see no way out of it. Understanding as we move forward. He's going to say in verse 6, he has made me dwell in darkness once again, understanding that it's one thing for me to just have that sense of hopelessness and not seeing a way out before he strikes my body and before he brings the depression, but understand how much deeper I'm sinking into it when he's adding reality to my disappointment. The reality is my situation, as we said before, is really disappointing right here for real practical reasons. As verse 7 is going to say, that's not going to end there. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. So it's bad enough my body is really afflicted. I can't see my way out, and it seems hopeless. But there are legitimately heavy chains. We're talking about metaphorically. There are things that are getting in my way. We talked about before, Murphy's Law. Have you ever been in a place where, right? Add to my sickness the fact that it now seems that every time I try something new, it's failing. And he's layering misery upon pain upon depression. And this is the reality that he was trying to keep them away from as he keeps going in verses 8. Yeah, 8 through the rest of that first 18 verses. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. I don't want to stop at every one of these verses. But they're really layering on something that's significant to understand about the places God is trying to keep us away from. As our brother talked about in prayer, please God, let us live in a way that does not motivate you to take a different attitude towards our prayers. We talk about it all the time. If we go through the Psalms and we see David, a man after God's own heart, saying the same thing, God, please let my prayer come to you. Understand what my mentality needs to be like if I'm going to make good on the new opportunities that God gives me. This is not David. David's dead now. And they still realize if we're going to build and move forward effectively, I got to live a life that's consistent with the things that I'm asking God to do. Otherwise, the prayers may be offered up in vain. They may sound great. They may be flowery, but I appreciate what my brother said before or as he's offering up the prayer. I need my life to add some value so that I'm not at the grocery store spending $30,000 for a loaf of bread, right? I can multiply my prayers. But the question is, what do they mean? What kind of life is representing the person who is praying to God at this moment? And that's another thing they know they need to fix because now it seems like their prayers are falling on deaf ears. Verse 9, he has blocked my ways with blocks of stones. He has made my paths crooked. Understand, right? 23rd Psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's not where they're at right now. That was David in a healthy relationship with God, saying no matter what paths you lead me along, I'm going to be okay because you are with me. We lost that in these earlier verses. He's not with them right now. He's not answering the prayers. And the paths seem crooked. They don't know which way to go. Remember, because they're trying to find their way in the dark. And so it's continually getting worse. As we'll go ahead and try to wrap it up. We'll start taking them in groups of verses. Verses 10 through 12. We're going to say, you know what else is happening along that pathway? You're being hunted by what? A bear. He is a bear lying in wait for me. A lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. Once again, these are not jokes. He is literally the one who is opposed to them now, likening himself to a bear or a lion. And guess what? He's not making it up. The lamentation is for who? It's for all Israel? This is the remnant. These are the survivors. These are the ones who effectively made it past the judgment of Israel or Judah at this time. Why was it just Judah at this time? Because he already carted off Israel. with those who were lucky enough to make it out of that judgment. And so now the nation, the last two tribes he gave a second chance to, now, as we said, we're looking at a fraction of the remnant. Because as he said early on in the book of, I think it was early on in Isaiah, early on in Jeremiah, no, it was Isaiah 6. I'm going to cut the tree down and leave a stump. But then I'm not done. It's the remnant. I'm going to burn the remnant again. And that's what we literally saw happening during the murder of Gedaliah, the governor who was left over the remnant, as he was killed and they were scattered. And God cut them in down even more. Our brother talked about it on our recent Wednesday night, right? That's what we're seeing right now. The Lamentations are the Psalms of the ones who have not just been cut down and left, but they have been passed through the fire after they were cut down. And so now we're getting to see piece by piece, what does that look like in my life? When the prayers are deaf, the pain is real, my pathway is crooked, and there really is something chasing me. Right? That's what happened. When he talks about that bear and that lion, it's not a metaphor. That's really what happened. These people died. Only a few of them made it out of this. Some of them fled to Egypt after the misery and after the killing was over. Others started over in Babylon. And here's the problem. The reason why he burned over the stump again is because some of the same things he was warning them about not to weave into their second chance, they started doing all over again. And that's the reason why ultimately we're going to get to a point in this chapter where God is not simply putting through this in vain. It's not simply vindictive. Ultimately, the question becomes, as we move forward, how do they still have hope? Verse 13. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all the peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness and has sated me with wormwood. What's it like in a time when he's described your condition as darkness? He turns the lights back on for what reason? So you can find your way out? No. So that all the people who were waiting to laugh at you can finally get that chance. Exactly, right? And so understand how he's throwing them into shame at the point he cuts the lights back on. You think it's a cold world? That's one of the reasons why he says, vengeance is mine, I shall repay. Because God sees all of the uncool stuff that we can do to one another. And one of the reasons why it's so important to seek forgiveness in a time we can be forgiven is there are times, I've talked about it before, I can do something to hurt you, move on, I'm not feeling the pain anymore. I don't remember. But guess what? The reason why justice is so important and where we're going to get to is, you think the Babylonians weren't crying out for help too in the day of their judgment? There's going to be a very different answer to the prayers of the Babylonians and the prayers of Israel once he starts listening to prayers again. And ultimately it has to do with, was the way that Babylon treated Israel just? Is the way that I'm treating people just? Why? Because to the degree that when God, by the time we get halfway through the chapter, he's going to start listening to prayers again, and that's when it gets bad for Babylon. As we said, the instrument of his discipline turns around and ends up finding their day of discipline. Why? Because Israel did have some legitimate prayers to offer based upon the fact that they weren't completely evil. And so what happens is all those prayers that people are offering up against me when I am doing them wrong, we talked about in the young people's class, one of the reasons why it's important not to lose track of judgment, especially giving into the urge to get even and take vengeance, is my math isn't good. I don't know enough about any of you even when I'm not emotionally hurt by you. I know even less when I'm angry at you. And so when I'm trying to get even with you under two things, limited vision and an upset temper, I will make a whole lot of mistakes that I need mercy for. But I'm not going to get if I don't understand limits and why he has told me that it belongs to him. Because as you start offering up prayers for God to vindicate you against the wrong I'm doing to you, God's still listening while I moved on about my business. I get blindsided by these things, and that's literally what's happened. They didn't see it coming in spite of the warnings, because it's like we talked about with the whole concept on Wednesday night of lawlessness. How did Sean Puffy Combs end up in a situation where it just seemed like he was having fun? But to the feds, his fun was a series of crimes that he wasn't keeping track of. But by the time they got all the witnesses together, we don't know what will happen at the trial. But I'm telling you, this is just how life works. Sometimes I'm just having fun, and God is seeing offenses. And that's the danger of lawlessness, of simply seeking my own way, as we talked about in the young people's class, without regard for how my acts and my life affect other people. See, God is willing to forgive insofar as I take on a more of a mindset of a David. And God will be able to contrast that a little more as we keep going forward, Verses 16 through 18. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance is perished. So has my hope from the Lord. You know where we're at right now? We're at the beginning of the happy part. So the question is, how are the people who are acknowledging not just their hopelessness, but all of the legitimate reasons they have to hope, how do they turn it around and hope anyway? Verse 19, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. That sounded great. Well, of course, the chapter's not over. You know, if I have half a chance, it's going to get morbid again. But understand there's a context. Does that mean they get a blank check? No, Marcus has been ranting for the last month or two about not being able to lose your salvation. I'm not doing that again. I'm going to let the chapter do it. Because he's not done. He's saying there's a context for this hope. Because, I could take that passage and say, oh, you mean his mercies never come to an end? Therefore, I don't care what the preacher says. God's love is infinite, and that includes me too. Well, it does. You're right. But understand it this way. The sun doesn't stop shining, or at least it hasn't stopped in my lifetime, right? At a certain point, we got a new heaven and a new earth, and he describes all that in the Revelation. But until then, the sun ain't going to stop shining any more than God's mercy is going to stop mercying. Oh, but the sun rays mean a whole lot. Well, it means something different on Earth than they do out. Is Pluto still a planet? I don't know where we're at right now in the science on that one. Right? Sun still shining means two different things where you are in the solar system. And so he's exactly right here. The sun is not going to stop shining on God's mercies. The question is, where am I? And that is the maturity that they show moving forward. They don't just have hope. They got a plan. And that's what starts in verse 25. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, the soul who seeks him. Sometimes the passage just preaches itself. Sometimes I feel guilty because I just harp on the thing over and over again. Please go back and read Hebrews 11 for me. This is a New Testament principle, right? The Lord is a rewarder of the, first of all, it's impossible, without faith it's impossible to please God. Because in order to please God, you have to realize that he is a rewarder of those who believe that he is. I just butchered that passage. That's why you go read it on your own. He is a rewarder of those who believe that he is and who diligently seek him in the New King James Version. I twisted the words up. The principle's the same. It goes back to the Lamentations. What am I doing while I'm waiting for God to give me my second chance? Am I just waiting? Because there are two different types of relief. There's a kind of relief that goes, I think I'm really, if I'm not ready. Here's the thing. I made a mistake right there that I commonly make. When I think I'm ready for a new opportunity, sometimes, exactly, right? Because what happens is I might have been sitting on my laurels a little bit too much in the days of preparation that God provided for me. See, because sometimes when I get into those days of preparation and I'm really studying what goes into my second chance, I am overwhelmed about the challenge that's in front of me. And so God, through reality, much like he's brought them through the first 18 verses, is helping me understand how inadequate I am for any opportunity. How inadequate I was for the opportunity that I just messed up, and how inadequate I am for everything that needs to go right for my next opportunity to go forward. And so part of it is doing the best I can to get enough reps in. So that as far as it matters to me, I'm ready for whatever burden or load God gives me. But even more than that, I just have to appreciate that the fact that I feel overwhelmed might be that I'm a little bit closer to being ready than I think, because I'm not forgetting how much of this depends upon God. Part of that revelation is God showing me how much he has for me to carry. And if I haven't been working out or doing the things I need to do to carry my portion, I've just wasted another opportunity. See, because he doesn't always tell me how much he wants me to carry with my portion of the load. All I know is he has not offered us free rides. The price of the salvation is free. I can never pay that. But he has described a situation where we each have some responsibilities in what he is planning for us next. And he doesn't always tell us how heavy that load's going to be. All I know is I got to get ready for whatever he's calling me to lift, to bear, or however long. It says run with endurance the race, however long I have to run. And with that, he's going to continue on. Verse 26, after he talks about diligently seeking God to be ready for the next opportunity, it is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth to the dust, that there may be hope. Let him give his cheeks to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. You're kidding. Why? Why should he be filled with insults? Well, one of the things that God calls us to do is confess, right? And there's a certain part of my load that I'm carrying that has to do with things I've done wrong, positions I've put myself in that I just shouldn't have been in, right? And so he says, to the degree you're suffering for that, that's not vindictiveness, that's just people who are seeing, right? And so I have to be ready because I don't know how long I'm going to have to endure those insults for. If I start insulting people back all over again, you remember what David's response was? When he was being kicked out of his own kingdom, chased out by his own son Absalom. And one of Saul's relatives got out and he was throwing stones and cursing David. And one of the soldiers like, this guy's cursing us? Remember, David walked with mighty men. And they're like, this guy's got it twisted. We're running from Absalom. We're not running from you. And he was like, sorry. He asked David permission. Let me just go take his head off. David was like, no. Why? Because David knew that they were in that circumstance because of stuff he did wrong. That's the way back. And that is what they're getting right here. I don't always want to wait as long as it takes God to say, okay, I'm done with your time out period. But the worst thing I can do is make my time out worse by retaliating in situations where I just need to own it. It was me. I did wrong. And part of what I'm going through, as we said before, is me growing to a place where I can acknowledge the things I'm doing wrong. Why? So I don't have to get to a place where God's cup of wrath is so full that he's pouring all of this tragedy on me. I can take correction as I'm going. I said the minister I had was nice enough to mentor me for a while. Passed not too long ago. But he always talked about the illustration I've used before. Christianity as this constant course-correcting activity. Before we had self-driving cars, you would think it's pretty weird if you got your car out there and just hit the gas pedal, took your hands off the gas. Your alignment might be real good, but it ain't that good. Because at a certain point, you're going to need to make some turns. You need to keep it within the lanes. You're going to need to do some things to help the car be at its best. Because it has limits, even with the technology and all the Tesla stuff and whatnot now, right? And so understand, we get it with our cars, but we don't necessarily get the degree to which it applies to our lives. And one of the reasons why it's so important to be able to take healthy criticism is because it keeps you from lamentation. It keeps you from getting to the point where God says, I'm going to give you free will. You don't have to listen. You turn your on or off. It's up to you. But understand, there are consequences with whatever choice you make. And I would like for you to suffer small as opposed to lamenting big. And so hopefully what they're doing while they're learning to listen to the taunts is realizing, next time I get my second chance, like I told you, before I decided I was finally going to go off to preaching school, I got tired of going down front, making public confessions. That's one of the advantages of that old Southern tradition of making public confessions. At a certain point, if you're really confessing the stuff that you're doing, you just get tired of it. It gets old. As opposed to when I'm keeping it concealed, it's just a little bit more comfortable to keep doing the same stuff, whether or not it's getting me consequences or not. And so here's the thing, that over time, if I get into the habit of correcting myself instead of seeking my validation from others, then they have more permission to correct me. Why? Because the things they're telling me, that's nothing compared to what you think that's tough, bud? I appreciate the comment. That's nothing compared to what I tell myself before I'm going to bed. Right? That's nothing compared to what I have to get sorted out in myself because I know I can do better. And the more we get into the habit, like he said, we ain't gotten there yet. No, we haven't. Okay, mama, quit talking and get to the point. They're going to get to a point where they realize the value in self-examination. I'm going to have to skip some things for time. But verses 31 through 39 are going to go on to talk about one of the things that they need to understand in addition to themselves is they need to have a better understanding of God. Why? Because in their good years, in their last opportunity, God was kind of an afterthought. And one of the things we always like to do is we like to make practical applications. Okay, am I just trying to study to know more about God's word just to check off a to-do list, or is there a practical value to having a better understanding of who God is and what he expects? That practical value I think we see in verses 31 through 39, where it says, "For the Lord will not cast off forever." This is not forever, y'all, 70 years. "But though he cause grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve the children of men, to crush underfoot all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High, to subvert a man in his lawsuit. The Lord does not approve. Who has spoken and it came to pass, unless the Lord commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins?" And going into the next chapter, as he talks about why I shouldn't complain about the punishment for my actual sins, verse 40 is going to lead the next section, which says, "Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord." Understand, he's understanding. Understand they see the value in a healthy self-examination. So then when you see brothers come and offer up the illustration or the words coming from the Passover, trying to get our minds right for taking the Lord's Supper, helping us to understand how it connects to what we do every week. One of the phrases connected to the Lord's Supper, it's easy to overlook because we hear it so often, is "let a man or let a person examine himself." Do you think that tradition was something that they just kind of, it'd be a good thing to say every week? But there's a reason why he calls us to self-examination every week. And I'm fully convinced, I might be wrong, but I'm fully convinced it has everything to do to keep us out of seasons of lamentation. If we look at our time of assembly less as a routine to take the bread and the juice as just a kind of formal ritual, as opposed to an opportunity to really ask God to help me see, am I on a path that leads to a kind of steadfast love, the kind that David saw, or the kind of steadfast love that leads to the lamentations of Jerusalem? And hopefully, if you don't take anything else away from it, whether it's the Lord's Supper or something else you get, just like we can set reminders on our phone, please set some sort of reminder out of love for nobody else other than yourself that reminds you to get into the habit of self-examination. Because see, God's standards don't change. And what books like this are trying to help us do is suffer small, not big. Why is that? Well, we got an example. Was David perfect? I use him as an example all the time. No, he wasn't. But what we're going to see through the rest of this chapter is a situation where God completely gave these folks over to their enemies. The difference with David, when he committed a murder by proxy and allowed a man to be basically chased by his enemies, which ended up coming out of his own household, is he allowed David to be chased by his enemies, but never overtaken by them. And understand, when we talk about salvation, it is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It is a free gift that looks very different according to what we have actually done. And David led the kind of life that got him a level of mercy that Jerusalem did not get when they got gutted and brought to the place of lamentation. As we keep going forward, verse 40, "Therefore let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven." Verse 43, "You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that, once again, no prayer can pass through. You have made us scum and garbage among the peoples." For time's sake, going on to the next section, where he's going to start to talk about those peoples or the enemies that they are now having to face the celebration, or that they are now having to live in shame before. Verse 46, "All our enemies open their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us, devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes cause me grief at the fate of all the daughters of the city. I have been hunted like a bird by those who were my enemies without cause. They flung me alive into the pit and cast stones upon me. Water closed over my head. I said, I am lost. Verse 55, I called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. You came near when I called on you. You said, do not fear. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. You have seen all their vengeance and their plots against me. You have heard their taunts, O Lord, all their plots against me. The lips and the thoughts of my assailants are against me all day long. Behold, they're sitting and they're rising. I am the object of their taunts. You will repay, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. You will give them dullness of heart. Your curse will be on them. You will pursue them in anger and destroy them from under your heavens, O Lord. It's not a happy ending. It sounds like something Marcus would have wrote. I'm joking, kidding, sorry. But understand the reality of their situation. And it's like we talked about last week. It's building on that principle of God's mercy is going to look very different to the pimp as opposed to the prostitute. Two people who have given their lives over to sin, but in order to actually love those who are being exploited and treated badly, his love is going to look a whole lot better for those who are exploiting them and treating them badly. And to make sure you understand, it's not just me making it up. The end of Jeremiah made that point for us. I didn't talk enough about the end of the Jeremiah. I was really planning, I told my brother this week, I plan to close out Jeremiah this week, but Lamentations got so good, I was like, well, here we go. So it really is the conclusion, because we're seeing Lamentations pick up where Jeremiah left off. And it's the day of the Lord isn't going to look the same for everybody. See, we get it today. Sometimes we're comfortable with the inequities when they work in our favor. But what happens is, if I don't understand God's perspective toward the inequities, I am not preparing myself mentally for what happens when he shifts the tables and turns things around. Because most of what we saw, one of those subtle under themes throughout the book of Jeremiah, just go back in your time this week. Please plug in the word turn or turns. Sometimes some little Bible app softwares, you can put turn with a little asterisk on it, and it'll be a root word where you can look up all the other ones. It's a unique word that comes up more in Jeremiah than it does in a lot of other books. I'm not going to say it comes up more than any other, but he uses it in the context of turning on those who turned on him. Turned on him as God? No, we don't turn on God, because we will revere God, as he will say in the book of 1 John. But we will treat our brother, who God will secretly come to us in the form of, how do we know? Matthew 25, right? What was the one simple test everyone had to pass? As we said before, how did you treat me when you thought I didn't matter? When I was locked up, starving, broke, fill in the blank. And Jesus says, when he congratulates those who pass through the lamentation and they see a healthy day of salvation and redemption, as it talks about, it's like, Lord, when do we see you? He says, as much as you did it to the least of these, you did it to someone like me? He says, you literally did it to me. And it's the same litmus test for failing in that area. So why does the preacher nerd constantly harp on that part of the New Testament? It's because so many of these passages seem to be, as I've said before, a hyperlink. If you clicked on that one simple story at the end of the book of Matthew 25, toward the end of the book of Matthew in chapter 25, when he's talking about the sheep and the goats, you get a pretty nice parable there. But the more you look at these stories and you see who does and who does not survive the judgment, then you're seeing a hyperlink that deepens our understanding of what it actually looks like in places God is trying to keep us from landing, a land of lamentations. And so understand how David himself, a lot of the songs are his laments. Some of them are his laments for things that he did to himself, when all he saw was, I'm quite sure, a strikingly beautiful woman in a season where he was just exhausted and tired, right? And it led him to one act that he was ashamed of, into another act he was ashamed of, into a period where, like we said, he was being chased by his enemies, right? Because just as David had, in order to cover up his sin, made himself an enemy of one of what turned out to be one of his most loyal soldiers, God turned, like I said, it's the measure we use, even for the ones he loves. He turned it back on David, and he turned him loose. He didn't just turn him loose to his enemies. He raised enemies in his own household. And so when David turned out of desperation, not out of wickedness, he was just desperate to hide the evil he'd done. He was ashamed. But he committed more sin in his shame, turning on one of his most loyal subjects. You know what was even more sad about it? It was almost like David was killing himself. How did David spend most of his time after he was anointed as a king? After he killed Goliath? He ended up doing the very same thing that Saul had done to him, right? And that is why, if God puts us in a tight enough circumstance, we might be shocked at some of the things we do under pressure. And so now that God is bringing it back to David, making himself an enemy of one of his own soldiers, now we're getting to see that the life David led had a lot to do with whether or not David was actually overtaken or captured and torn to bits by his enemies. And that's the mercy I'm hoping we'll find. See, what's happening is we're getting to see the difference between the kind of mercy that David got and the kind of mercy that Jerusalem got. See, Jerusalem still has a remnant. They still have hope. But the laments you're hearing from the people of Jerusalem are a whole lot different than the laments you heard from David, who never had to lose his life. He was chased for a while, but he got his kingdom back pretty quick. He was never going to get his boy back. His daughter was never going to be the same. But at the same time, what ended up happening is he did not have to go into the place of the Lamentations. And so I'm cutting the chapter short because I don't necessarily know I don't think we can get through. I think this is a good place to break. Big chapter, 66 verses. Please look at the rest of it on your own time. But understand, like they say sometimes out in the world, there are levels to this thing. There are levels to this thing. And even if the salvation or the forgiveness that we get or see in Jerusalem looks like it's pretty terrifying, just realize it's better than the forgiveness of Babylon. Why? Because they lived in such a lawless way. They couldn't find sympathy for those God had sent. God sent them on a mission. This was a mission from God. But because they carried it out so heartlessly, when they cried for help, there was no remnant. There was no burning of the remnant. Where's Babylon today? It's in Iraq, but where is Babylon today? Under a heap of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And so he may let another nation rise. He may allow some of the other people to rise out of there. But that place is as dead as God has said it was going to be. Understand the difference between the condemnation of a Babylon or a Sodom and Gomorrah and a Jerusalem. And God is helping you to see. Don't just be content with the fact that God's saying, oh, you'll live through this. We've talked about it before. What did it mean for Zedekiah? Exactly. You live through this in a condition you really regret for the rest of your life. You may actually want to have had it end earlier, right? And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That in these seasons where God gives us an opportunity, where he says, like I harp on from Hebrews 3 and 4 and other parts of Hebrews, that they wanted to tear out of the Bible because it did not fit with the concept of not being able to lose your salvation. It was so obviously a call to repentance that they said it didn't fit with much of what we call evangelical Christianity today. That now the tragedy is they don't have to tear it out of the Bible that was already assembled when they were counseling together to say whether or not this fits with our doctrine. They just convince us not to read it or to excuse it away and lose the connection it has to the places where God is trying to spare us. If we look more closely at passages like Hebrews 3 and 4, then we can avoid our own periods of lamentations. And God willing get the mercy of David as opposed to the mercy of Jerusalem or even a Babylon as we together stand and sing.